China now has a bigger economy than the United States. The ability of the United States to run the world has been undermined by China's growth and reemergence. And in the case of China, it is certainly true that their companies, with or without the government, a lot of their companies do engage in questionable practices.
Why do you think the West, Trump, maybe more generally, feel threatened by China economically? Is it more to do with feeling, I don't know, that they're going to lose jobs? Do you think it's more of an emotional reaction? Do you think there's something maybe more geopolitical there? What do you think?
Well, of the three things you mentioned, the last two, I think, are the key here. The United States has, for almost a century, been the world's undisputed superpower. That is now under threat because China has grown, incredible economic performance over 4 decades. It was going to happen. The only way the United States was ever going to remain as an undisputed superpower economically was if the poor countries were kept poor. But they're not, and they're developing. And China now has a bigger economy than the United States on some measures, purchasing power. And so its economy is going to grow relatively, but there are 4 times as many people, three to 4 times as many people. So as per capita income rises in China, the Chinese economy is going to be relatively bigger. And if you have a bigger economy, you've got more, you can spend more on defense, you can spend more on soft power, and so on. So the ability of the United States to run the world has been undermined by China's growth and reemergence. Because China was 2 centuries ago the biggest economy in the world. Now it's gone back to that. And it's not just China. I mean, I've just come back from India. I mean, India is going to be a future economic superpower like China. Eventually, it will eclipse the United States, probably. But this is economic development.
Yeah, I suppose my problem then, more generally, with this sort of, I'd say you have a generally laissez-faire attitude to trade, even though you've said there are some exceptions, is that quite often, and I'm not speaking in the Chinese case specifically, there can be imbalances of power. Let's take as a microcosm, a hyperbolic example, the Congo and the mining of lithium, right? There is theoretically free trade there, and yet the West really is using workers in horrific conditions in order to get the resources that they need. And we see this much more generally with post-colonial relations. Without being just laissez-faire, how can we look to redress those imbalances whilst nonetheless supporting the economies of both sides of that?
No, I'm not arguing for laissez-faire. I've made that fairly clear, both in the domestic economy and internationally. Of course, they've got to be safeguarded.
With regards to free trade,
I'm a general. Yes, I'm generally in favour of free trade, and the reason is very clear. If you look at what's happened in the world economy in the last 3 to 4 decades, hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty as a result of trade. It wouldn't have otherwise have happened. It's not just China, but India, which is becoming a middle-income country, Bangladesh, which was a basket case 40 years ago. Now, I wouldn't say it's not a rich country, it's not a developed country, but people, tens of billions have been lifted out of poverty. The same is now happening at the moment with Vietnam. I mean, and these are all countries that are progressing through trade. That's not to say that, where there are abuses, we shouldn't deal with them. And in the case of China, it is certainly true that their companies, with or without the government, a lot of their companies do engage in questionable practices. In some industries, there is a government subsidy which distorts competition, and the European Union, I think, is entirely within its rights to impose what are called countervailing duties to offset the unfairness that comes from government subsidy. We don't any longer run the Congo, so I'm not quite sure how you envisage imposing.
Nonetheless, there is an exploitative relationship there, is there not?
There is an exploitative relationship. All mining companies, whether they're Chinese or other, the Chinese are particularly their companies are particularly hard-headed and ruthless, but I think all companies have exploited weak African regimes, of which the Congolese is one of the worst.
Israeli airstrikes have struck Gaza's biggest hospital.
There's a clear indication that there's looser standards being applied to arms being supplied there.
Had I been in the government, I would probably have sought restrictions sooner. If we're going to restore public services, which are terribly battered in many areas, people are going to have to pay. Stop worrying about tuition fees. It's a form of graduate income tax. One shouldn't be scaremongering about that.
Why do you think the West feel threatened by China?
The ability of the United States to run the world has been undermined by China's growth. China now has a bigger economy than the United States.